there is not history being redone there. It's all fake, of course, a lot of the stuff that's being recreated, and it's not just in that place. It's also a lot of the, sort of old houses that we see everywhere that are supposed to create a sense of oldness and a sense of history, but they don't. I mean, they're very new, and they kind of eradicate, all the layers. And I think in some buildings, they are trying to do something different. Like I think at the, Neue Schönhauser Allee, that Apotheke right on the corner there, where they're trying to sort of show, the different layers. If you look on top of the building, you can see where they have some of the stuck still, and they're kind of exposing, the different layers. And I think that would much more be, sort of a historical version of architecture that really shows, the city as a palimpsest. The city has sort of different layers, and particularly in Berlin, where we have such radically different historical periods, rather than just going back on a nostalgic notion.
I think one can say, or I would say, that might make some people who were the drivers of that process unhappy, but I think what we saw in Berlin, purely in the field of architecture, was a debate that was starting very open, in an open format, and we see still buildings from that time, let it be from, the Museum of Liebeskind or Jean Nouvel's Galerie Lafayette, but very, very quickly the discussion and the debate got kidnapped by strong opinion leaders within a power structure that was economical on one end and political. And they formed a very typical, for me, typical German debate, comparing it to my 10 years in LA, of a right and wrong. It became a very moralistic debate of who is winning the mainstream and who has the instruments of power politically and economically to install a one solution for all spectrum. And they basically, there are famous anecdotes of Rem Koolhaas slamming the door and saying, "I never will build back in Berlin," and the only thing he did was on Dutch ground, the Dutch embassy, and so forth. And from that time, 15 years ago, we are still carrying that heritage of a debate that is not interested, it's not about curiosity, it's not about experiment in a city that calls for it. That even if you would create a compromise of, is it a wound to heal or a void to experiment with, it's driven by a fear of that Berlin couldn't stand it. Berlin couldn't stand talent, couldn't stand experiment, that the city would be destroyed if you would only build pink elephants, which is another famous quote of that group.
Well, Nicholas, did Norman Foster succeed, showed the wounds, created functional space, and also brought in new green architecture?
If we're talking about Norman Foster's Reichstag transformation, it's clearly a high-tech version of an old form. So no one ever had the idea to talk about what does representing stately power mean in terms of an architecture for a city. So they were just plus or less modern rebuilding a historical form with this coupole. So I think, and what's disturbing to see is the speed and this strange will to rebuild the city within a decade. So it was kind of an agoraphobia at that time of the then 50 to 60-year-old town planners to close every void in the city and to do that what they called healing wounds. And so playing with these open spaces was nothing that they liked very much, because they thought the city has to be narrow streets, and they tried to rebuild, of course, a culture of density. But if you look at pictures of Potsdamer Platz in the 20s, you see in neon lights and a chaos of the most different forms and little skyscrapers, to German standards, skyscrapers, like high-rise buildings. So it looks completely different than it looks now. And if you look at Potsdamer Platz, as we're talking about Potsdamer Platz, the most funny thing you can see there is that they scaled down the windows of the high-rise building to a minimum that is allowed in Germany to make the building look bigger. So if we're talking about authenticity, it's a complete fake. Even the scale is fake, because it looks like a 160-meter high building, but it's much smaller, but they reduced the scale. So it's if you look at it, you think it's a 3/4 model of a skyscraper. And people have to work in it and live in it.
Small people.
And, yeah, people you automatically get smaller when you're sitting in these buildings. So it's complete, even that is a complete fake. And so this whole discussion about authenticity and rebuilding the vividness of city is on a totally wrong track because they try to rebuild formal structures instead of understanding structural ways of making a city more lively and more vivid. So that's why everybody's talking about Schinkel, and what they do is to rebuild forms Schinkel invented. But if you think in the spirit of Schinkel, of course you would have to create another architecture than the Reichstagskuppel by Foster, which is like a sleek, modernist version of a historical, pretty stupid form.
So Roger and Greg, is this conversation completely alien, or do we have any kind of parallel issues and debates in Los Angeles?
Well, one of the many guiding and generative myths about Los Angeles is that it's a city of the future. It's all about progress. So Villaraigosa is just the last person in 100 years of claims about being the capital of the Pacific Rim. So from 1880 forward, really almost from 1850 forward, people are talking about a Pacific century emerging and that there's going to be a capital to that, and it's going to be Los Angeles. First it was an agricultural empire, then it was a commercial empire, but in all of this discourse, Los Angeles is always about the future, always about progress, with a capital P. Now, the past plays into this, of course, because there shouldn't be one. Right? I mean, it's all about the future. And unlike Berlin, where there has been lots of loss and there continues to be destruction, creative destruction, a process of creative destruction, in Los Angeles, history literally unfolds in space. So although people think about it as a place that's been shaped by creative destruction, where the past has been ignored, on the contrary, come to Los Angeles. I can show you shotgun houses in Lincoln Heights. I can show you workers' cottages in Atwater Village. I can show you basically every epoch of building is still on the ground and in place. In essence, rather than tearing down and rebuilding, it just moved out. And so it almost, not in the growth of the trees model a la Chicago School, because there was always multiple centers in Los Angeles, but you can just see the interstices fill over time. And these are different epochs. So the San Fernando Valley is built in a pattern with a model with types that are all of a moment. Same with Westchester, same with Compton. I mean, you pick your site and you can see the moment frozen in time. And so in that way, it's a very interesting laboratory for urbanism, because all these things are there. But again, unseen. So people don't spend time looking at Lincoln Heights and East Los Angeles and those parts of the city because they're just not supposed to be there. I mean, some of that has to do with who's there, primarily Latinos rather than Anglos. But you can see this past
we
there.
find ourselves in Berlin, this, to me, odd phenomenon where every day architectural debates are occupying the front page. Currently, of course, the Stadtschloss. Should we, or do we want to bring questions of architectural history to the front page discourse in Los Angeles, Roger?
I don't think that that's really relevant in Los Angeles because it's almost a godless environment. It's the opposite of the right versus wrong. I think that there's actually such a disregard for the meaning of history that one can actually use history with complete impunity. For instance, it's no longer, I think we moved from a traditional kind of low canopy, medium kind of a tree model of growth where you can tell when something was built by the style that it was in and the pattern that was laid down, to a point now where it's more like hip hop, where you can just pick and choose what style you want on the basis of what your marketing team tells you. So now you have developers who are building on the basis of Disneyland as the urban model, not on the basis of real cities. But of course, actually, if you look back in the history of Los Angeles, it's always worked that way.